Yeah, I think that makes it parity. I'm going to check chat real quickly. If there's anything that's not working up, yep, Tom said it looks great. Excellent. So we will begin in a second. I think, how's my hair? I think that's about centered. Excellent. Okay, do we want to turn down the?
Yeah, let's do this guy. We will put it center.
Cool. So I didn't really, that's excellent. Okay, great. Everyone can see? It's a mushroom. See if I can hide the zoom slider. Yep, perfect. There might be some information here. So we will go through a lot of different things. My name is Rami. Some of you may know me. Feel free to interrupt and ask questions. Some of it may feel irrelevant, but I'm just trying to kind of generally define and outline anything that could go into producing photos of your desired subject, from 1 mm or sub-millimeter to a mushroom to a person. Some of the concepts may seem a little bit theoretical at first, but if you bear with them, it will be helpful to your further explorations, since you can get into this for any reason you want, but things like shutter speed, aperture, ISO are going to implement or influence whether or not your photo works. So sometimes your photo might just seem like it's not working. It's not typically your camera or your lens or anything else. It's more often something that you need to rectify in your settings to be able to get a photo that works given the conditions that you're working with. So I'm just going to have this here for time. So I have a lot of slides to go through, so I'm going to go through a lot of them really quickly. Please feel free to ask any questions. Just raise your hand if you have any questions or you want a clarification. This slide deck should be, I think, recorded. You can feel free to reach out to me. I didn't put my website on here, but you can feel free to look there for extra photos and things like that. I'll start with, this was a tiny ascomycete. I'm not sure how well it'll show up on Zoom because the thing happens, but there's a tiny pine needle, basically, with a tiny little dot on the edge. It's about 1 mm big. And I shot it with a 10x objective. So I was getting 10x on sensor. So something that is 1 mm will end up being 10 mm wide on my sensor, or tall, which covers most of my sensor. So this is a pretty zoomed in photo of this tiny ascomycete. I don't know what it is. I didn't get any help online. I'm not good at ascomycetes at all. Nobody had an idea of what it was. But as you can see, I'm also very highly curious what these tiny structures are kind of popping out. They're definitely, at first I thought, could this be contamination or something? But it's definitely part of this ASCO. So if you have any, ideas, please feel free to let me know. But I'm just going to cover the first three sides, what we're going to cover. So we're going to cover just basic photography: exposure, aperture, ISO, shutter speed, depth of field, white balance kind of generally, illumination, diffusion. Diffusion is probably the most important part of illumination if you're bringing illumination with you. And in some cases, you may want to bring illumination, or you may want to create a certain feel or mood for a picture. And controlling the illumination either by planning around the illumination that exists from the sunlight or bringing your own illumination can absolutely change the story you're telling, the emotion you're conveying in the photo. Illumination, sharpness, aberrations, which will be relevant if you ever get to the point where you're interested in buying lenses and researching what lens you want to use, what you want to use for a particular purpose. But I will emphasize also that just using your cell phone is absolutely a-okay. You can take amazing photos with cell phones. You can add supplementary lighting, which will absolutely change the game in terms of taking good cell phone photos. You can do it for artistic purposes or to document something very well in the field for later. And all the photos and all the slides are mine except for some diagrams. So some diagrams, I had some attribution there, but otherwise they're all my photos. This is Copernopsis. I was told to look at stercoria on some dung. This was shot with a 3.7x microscope objective, just handheld with high-speed continuous stacking, which I'll show you a quick demo of. It's how I like to do a lot of stacking, because although the tripod is cool, it's clunky, and I'll usually just end up like asking Joe or Alex to carry something because I have too much junk, or whoever I'm going with. So it can be nice to do high-speed continuous stacking. You still get great results, and you can do it up to 3.5 or 5x, which is a lot of macro magnification. I'll cover macro photography. Macro just generally means small subjects, small field of view. We're often referring to 1-to-1 magnification on sensor when we're talking about macro magnifications. All the principles of regular photography apply. Sometimes they just become more demanding because errors show up much more clearly. Photo stacking is also a useful tool when you're trying to get the sharpest photos, because via the laws of physics, basically after you go in close enough, your effective aperture is becoming reduced, and it's impossible sharpness without a very narrow depth of field and a very wide aperture. So because of the laws of physics, we need to use stacking to get a very detailed photo rather than closing our aperture down very small and experiencing diffraction to get additional depth of field. If we want to preserve resolution, stacking's the way to go. We'll also cover, oh, and this last one is again that same mushroom that we saw in the last slide, but a little bit older, kind of grown up. Go ahead.
Close the aperture a bit, does that ever work?
Not close the aperture. Well, yes, you can if you don't mind the diffraction or you're below the diffraction limit. So a very wide aperture like f2, f2.8, f4, often f5.6 or so is where a lot of macro lenses maybe just stop down a tiny bit, but pretty wide still. They're the sharpest. If you don't mind the diffraction, yep, you can close the aperture down. You can get a deeper depth of field, but you will have to blast it or hope for a bright day, right, as you're getting into macro. If you're doing something as a wide lens, if I was taking pictures of you guys, in here it would be pretty dark unless I had a very fast lens to kind of get anything out of it. But if there was natural light out here, I don't have to worry. I can close the aperture down pretty well because I'm not trading off on shutter speed or jacking up my ISO to get the right exposure. So yeah, accessory lighting is super helpful. At the very end, I will do UV photography before this, just in case anyone feels like snooze fest on the photomacrography. I like it, but it's a little bit more technical. I will cover, if we have time, using microscope lenses, objectives, finite and infinite systems, what stacked photos with very small increments of movement look like. That's why I brought my stacking rig, which for the Zoom people, I'll show you guys later if you want to. I don't know about framing, but hopefully I'm still in the frame. And we'll cover some illumination. I do want to shout out photomacrography.net pioneered the use of microscope optics on regular camera sensors. Written by, or the site is made by Rick R.J. Littlefield. He's the author of Zareen Stacker, which is one of the two bigger stacking programs that you could use. He's amazing, excellent resource of information. Sometimes it feels like too much information because you have to Google like 20 terms to like understand the depth of knowledge that he's sharing, but he's very generous with his time. Another great resource is Close-Up Photography by the recently sadly departed Robert O'Toole. He was also foundational in exposing a lot of really cool enlarger lenses, really cool cheap macro lenses, so you don't have to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get amazing results in the studio or even out in the field to some extent. So closeupphotography.com is another great resource that has tons of microscope objective comparisons as well as enlarger lenses, and it was a great loss to lose him this year, unfortunately. My qualifications, none in particular. So, you know, grain of salt, please, if I speak in any case, feel free to look up what I'm supposed to be saying in that case. There may be technical areas at a really fast time trying to get this all together. But I'm just trying to communicate as many things on the technical side of what goes into especially macro photography, because that's where it becomes extremely demanding, but photography in general and lens systems and cameras, so that you know what you're trying to navigate around. Because there's a lot of to try to wade through in terms of, oh, this is the best, or oh, this is the best. And they're really, you'll see in a second. But each concept of this can be an exploration in and of itself. I'll try to like brush upon the edges. So what camera system is best for photography? And this is an Abortoporus biennis from Philadelphia. Really cool mushroom I had never met before. I was pretty excited to meet it finally. So I took a quick stack with flash. Didn't really care about it being perfect. Just a photo of a mushroom, right? Documentation-wise, it's great. And the answer, try not to be cheeky, is it doesn't matter. It's pretty hard to go wrong with modern cameras. You may find cameras that are more suitable for your work. Either you don't want to ever carry lenses, or you're really attracted to a certain ecosystem of lenses. Sony E has tons and tons of third-party lenses, for better or for worse. Some of them are quite excellent. Sometimes you might like the color rendition from a certain, the color science that comes out of certain cameras, the features, the menus. The most important thing is that you can use it, and you can use it for the applications you want, and that you have practice on whatever camera, including your smartphone, using it to the best of your abilities. Some cameras allow for faster, high-speed continuous stacking, which is what I do. I stack at 11 frames per second or 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I'll do it 11 in 1 second. So if I move the focal plane very small amount in that period, I have a continuous stack of each focus depth of the subject over the, say, millimeter that I moved in that period. So some cameras might have better FPS performance. Some cameras have a deeper buffer. So the number of photos you can take continuously before it says, okay, now you have to wait 45 seconds for me to write to the memory card. That's actually the only reason that I upgraded my camera very recently was I was, out in the field with my friends, Alex and Joe often, and I'd just be sitting there and like, dang it, I have to wait 50 seconds to try to take more photos. I could also not take deeper stacks or like the hundreds of photos. And now I've done on that before about 900 photos manually racking it or making it move high speed continuous, which kind of feels like a little cheat in terms of usually I'm doing one photo, wait 2 seconds, and it increments a tiny bit when I'm doing very high mag. Again, just figure out what you want to do. Sometimes you might have a preference towards in-body stabilization, which means that if I have tiny movements when I'm holding the camera, which is no matter what, no matter how steady you are, the camera will compensate by, in several axes, moving the sensor plane so that it cancels out your hand movements, and you can shoot at a slower shutter speed appropriate to the amount of motion that you're looking for, which means that you can shoot in lower light conditions. Some cameras have better video performance. Video macro is amazing as well. Something else that you could explore. You might prefer certain ergonomics. There's a lot of proprietariness in the camera world, which really annoys me as a person who likes to tinker a lot. For example, my newest body has in-body stabilization, which would mean that something else called pixel shift, where the sensor goes just up 1 pixel down and like that to take 4 exposures, combine them into a higher resolution photo because it's eliminating some of the noise via some math. It should be implemented in my camera, but they didn't because they didn't want to, they didn't want to take sales away from their more expensive cameras, right? So we have to sit there and like deal with like the kind of protectionist and anti-consumer things that the cameras companies do. So there's a lot of gripes you can have with every system. There's no shade thrown at any specific camera. They're all tools. Explore. Make sure that you're playing, basically. Here's an Amanita muscaria from a little bit early in the year where it seemed a little bit more hopeful. We were getting a bunch of rain kind of on Bertaud. This was a stack of about 60 photos. Most of my photos here are stacked. Some of them are not. But this was natural light plus a little light bar about this big, just kind of like aiming at it from the side. So one thing I like here is that because it's a stacked photo, I don't have just this plane of focus in here, but I have good resolution all the way to the back, and I have a very, very deep depth of field. Make sure to budget for lenses if you are buying a real camera, quote unquote real. You can also put some lenses and optics on your phone. I've used a Belomo loop before, just directly to my phone to get closer with great results. There are also people that are now adapting other lenses and some aftermarket lenses just for your phone. And people online are taking excellent macro photos of bees, of bugs, and things like that. That, to be honest, depending on the resolution that you're doing, if you're not printing, they can rival taking a camera out and taking a dedicated photo. Because, I do encourage you to print if you do end up taking photos with a real camera. Facebook and everything else, really tiny compressed photos. Sometimes you don't need the highest resolution things. Lenses will also impact your creative ability, how you are able to express the scene the way that you want to, and your options and what you can do a lot more than a camera. So the lenses really do allow you to express different artistic visions much more effectively than, oh, this camera body is what I need. And just to demonstrate that real quick, I'm going to go to, again, photomacrography.net. And this person, Rick, was using the camera that I gave up on in 2006. The only other time I've explored photography is 2006. I got a Canon EOS 300D Rebel. And I was just like, I tried reversing lenses. I didn't really know that reversing the lenses and then stopping them down would give me too much diffraction to get good blurry, non-blurry photos. Didn't know about photo stacking. Meanwhile, Rick, 2006, he posted these gorgeous photos, which I think I identified as Copernopsis, the trabecular cystidia, which are these cells that go in between the gills of certain Copernopsis species. And he took a live microphoto in 2006 that, I thought, oh, wow, cool. I haven't ever seen reflected light microscopy, photomacrography with cameras before. Meanwhile, almost 20 years ago, here's an excellent photo showing microstructures of fungi. And, had I known, had I had like maybe a little bit more resilience to keep learning, I could have worked with my current equipment to do a lot of cool things. So that's just to emphasize that equipment cost isn't the end all be all. Something you'll find pretty early on if you end up trying to buy a camera is a sensor format. And sensor format is just saying that, say we have this framing of this large mountain range full frame would give you this field of view with the same focal length lens. APS-C, which is what I shoot, would give you a little bit of a crop, a less of a view. And the difference can be also there is more light on the sensor, depending on how big your sensor is. So larger sensors will afford you more light, which can give you better performance, better low light performance, less grainy photos. And there's some other implications there too. Now, I'll have a lot of just random photos sprinkled in. Sorry, it's just, breaking it up a little bit. But this was in Philadelphia. I brought the UV light out, and I just kind of noticed that there was this orange stuff that glowed under UV. In regular light, and I took 2 different exposures because I wasn't sure how detailed I wanted. All I kind of noticed was a little bit of orangey yellowness or oranginess. But as soon as we turned the light off and shine the UV light on it, we could see that it was all glowing very, very orange. Now, I don't know if this is mushroom because I lost the sample, but I'll hopefully have somebody ship some out to me. But this is just kind of the thing that you can do with stacking as well. You don't only need to do it for getting the sharpest or close macros. You can also do it to overcome something like a lighting limitation. So right here, I took a stack of 30 photos, high-speed continuous. And because I had my aperture wide enough open that each photo was properly exposed, I actually got the photo handheld. Other option would have been I put it on a tripod. I do a 3-second exposure or something like that. I didn't have my tripod. This allowed me to take this photo really quickly, 1.5 seconds, stack it and composite it, and get enough light into my lens to expose it properly at each frame, handheld, which affords a lot of freedom. So just kind of go out there and play and figure out what style you want to do if you do photography. A base concept we'll talk about is exposure, and then specifically a histogram for exposure. I think I should have histogram right here, is the amount of light collected over the period, exposure in general, sorry, which we'll talk about the histogram soon, is the amount of light that is coming to your sensor over the period that your shutter is open. So a 1-second shutter time would be like open, close. And that's when your photo is being exposed. Any movement that happens over that frame, you will see as a blur, right? So that's just the general idea is we're trying to measure the amount of light coming out and quantify the exposure. It's impacted by your ISO, which is your sensitivity to light, your aperture, how wide open that your lens is, the effective aperture, which is under the specific conditions that you are in, what the actual aperture is. And it's also impacted by shutter speed. This is a entomopathogenic fungus. I'm not sure what it is specifically. Damon Tig in California mentioned that some things that they had sequenced came out to Pandora species. So I don't even know how you sequence something that tiny or if they just really are fine with continuing to try. But this was a tiny entomopathogenic fungus, just looked like a tiny speck, 2 millimeters big. Looked at the loop. I'm like, yep, I see some wings. Let's see what it looks like under the microscope. And the annoying thing about working with these is that it's very easy to drop them and crush them. So inevitably, I crushed this, but we'll see what it looks like if it dried out. So not to actually remember this as a real concept, but just to remember that they're interrelated. Sometimes you'll hear exposure triangle brought up, but these are the things that impact the exposure of your camera. And these are from onehourphotography.com and colarvision.com. But you have shutter speed from very fast shutter, which will let in way less light, but will freeze motion. So instead of one, it's but instantaneous for shutter open to shutter close, to very slow shutter speed, which is brighter, but will blur motion. We have ISO, which can go from 100 up to very high, and that will impact the amount of noise in your photo. So you'll see little weird multicolored spectral things going on in a high ISO noisy photo. And the aperture, which will impact the depth of field. So a very tiny aperture specified by f/22, you could see the trees, the mountains and everything. Very narrow aperture lets in way more light, but only the very front element or whatever you're focused on will be in focus. And I also just want to introduce the fact that modern cameras have a lot of options for getting your exposure right, including exposure compensation. So you can even set the bounds of, I only want you to play with these number of ISOs because I don't want the ISO to go above 800. It's too grainy for me. But your camera will modify your aperture and your shutter speed, or just your aperture or some other element, however you restrict it, to fit within that and get you an exposed photo. One thing that is really useful is to eventually look at a histogram, either when you're shooting, because if you're shooting on a mirrorless body or an SLR or anything else, you can go replay and you can see the histogram. This will give you an idea of the distribution of the tones in your image from shadows to midtones to highlights. And you can see the highlights are represented by a pretty high distribution of highlights in this photo, some midtones, and pretty much almost no shadows in here. So what we want to do when we look at the histogram is not only just look at that the photo is good, but then make sure that we're not touching the edges here, because the edges here mean that we're clipping and we're going into the territory of unrecoverable highlights or shadows. So there's information that, especially if you develop raw, that you can move things around, you move the exposure around, you can still get a good photo, get a good exposure. However, if you touch the territory of the camera sensor is either oversaturated with photons to the point at which it can't actually properly gauge any detail, or undersaturated and you're just getting noise, you'll have unrecoverable elements of your photos and that can destroy them sometimes. So an example of overexposure here, this is a stack and this is dark table. I have clipping on the highlights here. So you can see this left leaf petal has very, very little to no detail and maybe some haze kind of that is apparent from all the light bouncing here. Whereas on this other side, this is properly exposed. So there's detail here. You can see these long lines here. You can see some pollen grains. And we're sure there's long lines here in pollen grains, but I can't see them because I overexposed this photo. And this is a stack, but I overexposed this. It's not recoverable. Now a little bit better exposure. This little fly, this is actually a bee mimic fly, which is kind of cute. It's got the little stripes down there. This exposure is fine. Maintain detail on the eye, maintain general detail, some pollen and things like that. And I got a decent photo of the cutie. And again, decent enough exposure. I'm not clipping on either side. There's another stack of maybe 30, 40 photos. Got the little, I think these are liverworts. I can't remember with like the little tiny plants, what they are. And I got the little guy in there just fine. Another example of overexposure, because I was in a rush that day. This, I think, might be Merismodes, which is a basidiocephaloid basidio. And this is Serratio mixa. And there's this amazing detail when I get this close with about 4x with the Serratio mixa of just like these tiny microstructures on the Serratio mixa. But because I overexposed it, and the other thing I was contending with was some overexposure on the rim here, multiple kind of brightnesses of an object in your field can kind of be difficult to balance the correct exposure on. So I should have gone a little bit less. I'd have a little bit less exposure on this. Maybe, I don't know if this would be a springtail or anything. If anyone knows, feel free to let me know. But if I could have balanced a little bit better for this to be darker and then this to be darker, I could have had a photo that wasn't too blown out here. A little bit better exposure. Again, Merismodes, again at 5x or so. This is my guess is Merismodes from just Googling from images. And these are pine pollen right here. So that kind of gives you a scale. You know, you've seen little specks of pine pollen sitting around. These are only a couple of millimeters big for fruit bodies. And the cool thing about if you do ever do macro is they're just fungi just everywhere. You know, you take a photo at a macro and you're like, oh, there's like 2 other tiny mushrooms that I didn't see in here, you know, ascos or something else. Again, I did do a microscope stack of the Merismodes, and it should have some encrusted kind of hyphae at the end of here, but I didn't worry too much because the annoying part was it closed up, like I think these ones often do. So I wasn't able to see. However, I did see before it closed up, little prongs, 4 prongs here in little arrangements, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's a basidiol. It's a 4-spored basidiomycete. These are little spores on the basidiol. And I was super curious. Unfortunately, I didn't get it before it was closed up. What the heck these hairs are inside of it. It almost looks fleshy, like kind of odd to me, but really fascinating, right? Again, you might get some opportunistic things. This was a little bit overexposed because this, I think it was a stonefly, did not stay very long on this hydnum. So I took a picture, and by the time I was like, oh, let me turn my flash power down, it was gone. So I worked with what I got. I think he's a cutie, looks really interesting. I think it also could have been like a very, very, very fun composition that I was super excited about, but you know, just a little bit overexposed and the moment passed. It's not always fun in games when you're looking at insects, but it is fun in general. But these are mites on a very drenched bee that I saw. So you get to see kind of this web of interconnected life. Obviously, we know about fungi and everything else, but everything seems to be parasitizing everything in every, you know, kingdom, right? It's super fascinating. I took a lot of pretty sad photos of this bee struggling on the ground before I was like, I can't take it. I can't look at you anymore. Let's see. I will skip this, and then if I have time at the end, I'll mention it. It's just something about basically how the opening of your, I'll just summarize it by saying the opening of your lens, the aperture, dictates the resolution as well as the depth of field. So a wider opening on your lens will give you more details. You can resolve closer details than a very narrow aperture. And if we have time, we'll cover that at the end. So the base concept I want to also cover is aperture. This is applicable to your phone as well. So I think almost all phones, but like definitely newer phones the past 4 or 5 years, you can change the aperture to change the depth of field. You can definitely change the ISO. So lower ISO, you'll get sharper photos, but you might need to supplement lighting. You can definitely change the shutter speed as well. So if you know that your phone is on a tripod, you could set it so, oh man, there's not much light coming in, but I can do a 2-second exposure and I can get a properly exposed photo in this very low light condition, even with my cell phone. And I know like Ikuko does like voice like shutter actuation. You can also use a little clicker for your phone to be able to set it somewhere stable and actually get a photo off using settings that aren't just the auto settings on your phone. So aperture is measured in f-stop, which is the focal distance, focal length divided by the effective aperture diameter. And this is a wider aperture designated by a lower f number. You can see it is a wider opening. And this is a very narrow aperture with a higher f number. And you can see also from this photo from capturetheatlas.com that our depth of field here with a very wide aperture is very small. But with a very narrow aperture, although we're not letting in a lot of light, so you can't always shoot at this, and you also don't get as much sharpness, has a much deeper depth of field. So this will dictate also things like your background separation. If you're trying to tell a story where one subject is very emphasized, you can use a lot of tools for that, but one could be a very shallow aperture or something that affords a shallow depth of field. Another might be a longer lens, so a telephoto lens will separate the background from the subject better. A 200mm lens will give you more separation if I was taking a photo of somebody in the audience than a very short wide angle, 16mm lens. This is Arceria. I think that I can't remember the epithet, and I don't usually like label things that are slime molds because I don't know anything about slime molds, but I think it is the Arceria that like looks exactly like this. So this is a pretty tiny slime mold, really fascinating to me that it kind of comes out of these little satchels there, and it's just like this awesome little web of reproductive structures, and a few more photos of Arceria. When I get to a 5x stack, you can actually see that like this is a little bit varicose, and I can't recall what the structure is called for slime molds. It's not hyphae, right? There's another word for it. Not sure. But another kind of fun thing is that you can see the underdeveloped or immature spores are white, but when I took some spore debris to look at it, you can see the mature spores get some pigmentation. That's something I've found pretty often, right? And you know that anyway from looking at a young mushroom, a young agaricus. It might be like whitish or pinkish, and then eventually it starts to get to the color when you're identifying the mushroom and determining the spore color that you would expect. Oh, and yeah, again, anyone feel free to ask questions in Zoom chat if you'd like. But these are just fun to me, right? Like just looking at tiny stuff. That's half of what I'm doing. Another concept, continued aperture. It influences the exposure by allowing more or less light. It influences the depth of the field. It also influences sharpness. Wider apertures, higher numerical apertures when you get into microscope optics give you better resolution. They can define smaller details. However, that sometimes comes with, when we're talking about regular camera lenses, more aberrations. So you often will have to stop down a camera lens a couple of stops to get rid of some of the aberrations or things that can ruin the look of your image to some extent. Numerical aperture, when we're talking about microscope optics, is related to f-stop by 1/2 times the f number. And fast lenses, you'll sometimes hear a lens referred to as fast, has a wide opening, which means I can shoot in low light conditions with a high shutter speed, whereas slow lenses, f5.6 beyond, that means very tiny opening, means my shutter speed's got to be pretty slow in equivalent lighting conditions to be able to get enough light to expose this and not have an underexposure. Another tiny concept that I didn't remember, learn until empirically is that depending on the focus ring, and I kind of want you to think of a 3D view of when you have the focus ring and you're turning the focus ring on a camera or changing the zoom level on your phone, you're sending out like a little cone basically of light that's going out, not light that's going out, sorry, you're imaging a cone, and there's a plane a focal plane that you're shifting back and forth with the zoom ring. So you're shifting this 3D like slice of, if it was a picture of me, you know, front and back of me. Oh, I shifted it behind, in front of. But also, as you shift further out, your depth of field increases. So if you get really close to a subject, your depth of field will be smaller, even with the same aperture, versus if I shoot with the same lens and I zoom way out and I'm taking photos of the mountains, I got a little bit of throw there of zone in focus. The other interesting thing is sharpness is kind of a psychological phenomenon as well. So we're not thinking that like, oh, this is in focus. This might be in critical focus, but the graph of in focusness could go slowly up and then kind of dwell down. So if you're looking at my nose versus my eyes versus my hair with a really tiny depth of field, there might be a point of critical or most focus, but it's not like this linear like function that's very simple that that like, oh, just this is in focus and I judge this not to be in focus. Because sometimes this might be in focus enough for your uses, right? Like that, it's pretty critical if you're taking portraiture that like your eyes are in focus because it gives a lot of life to the photo. It doesn't feel like dead in a way. So your criteria can change. Diffraction can reduce resolution, kind of gives you blurring once you're past the diffraction limit for a given system, a certain setup, a certain magnification, focal length, etc. These are some Hymenocyscus I collected a few days ago. There's still tons of tiny mushrooms out there. You just have to crawl around in tiny creeks and use a little loop or something else and go, that looks like a speck that isn't like anything else, vegetation or anything else. And then you go back home and you look under the dissecting microscope and you're like, yep, that's a mushroom. So these Hymenocyscus were pretty immature, so they're just a couple of millimeters big. But I shot this with a 3.7x objective handheld. You can see some finer detail on the side. Don't think you can see any spores in here, but it's kind of nice to get some texture in. I do really enjoy the textures. So really quickly, just to understand the focal plane, again, this thinking about this like cone of light where there's this in-focus plane going out. At increasing distances, it might get a little bit thicker. You can see everything around here. I'm shooting at f1.1 with a pretty fast lens. That's a pretty cheap lens too. Everything out here is very blurry. So really, even this might be a pretty soft image for right here, but there's a lot of separation between the background and the foreground. Now that might be useful for an artistic effect. It might be useful for something you're envisioning for a photo. You can also play with your backgrounds are extremely important when you're getting to macro or any photography. You might play with, oh, I see something kind of shiny in the background. If I include that, I will see these what are called like bokeh balls or just out of focus highlights or rendering that is going on back there. And you're like, oh, I kind of like that there's some color in them. So now I have some multiple colors behind my background. If you want flat backgrounds that have no, that are black as a subject, just have nothing behind the object. So anything that's not reflecting light back into the sensor will just be imaged as black. So if I took, you know, a photo of like my hand and there wasn't enough light and I just had flash that just illuminated my hand and there was nothing bouncing it back, there's like an infinite void behind it, you'd see just the hand in a black void. Compare that f1.1 with it stopped out into about like f4, and you can see not only did sharpness increase, my depth of field increased, so I can see a lot more of this microscope objective is in focus at f4, but at the expense of my background is no longer nearly as creamy. Now, something I did here was I used the exact same amount of light for this because I have a little roll where I just rack the aperture and I can show you that the amount of light coming into your sensor decreases as you use a higher aperture. So same amount of light coming into the scene, but less light coming into the sensor because we have a much tinier hole versus a much larger hole for the last one. But you can also see the nature of the out of focus highlights has changed. It gets more structural. Sometimes you might want certain lenses for the fact that they're very creamy at certain apertures. There's like less outlining. So here's a GIF of aperture f1 to f12 or so. And you can see that not only as I make the aperture more narrow, the foreground and just out of the background gets more and more resolved. The depth of field is increasing, but you can see the background gets more structural. It looks less creamy. There's maybe a little bit less subject separation. And you can use either. It's a creative choice for you as to what aperture you want to shoot at, dictated to some extent by the conditions you're shooting under, also overrideable to some extent by if you bring supplementary lighting. Another concept, again, ISO. So ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor to light. Higher ISO means that the sensor is more sensitive to light, but it also comes at the expense of noise. So Sharpness and noise are to some extent not like you always have to shoot at the sharpest ISO ever. Sometimes you want the composition. You have to work with what is acceptable. It's kind of your determination if this astrophoto, the aurora, is okay with extra noise, or it's is this okay that this portrait of this person is a little bit grainy? It can work just fine. But ISO is the thing that will control how grainy or how noisy your photo is. Your sharpest or least noisy ISOs are lower ones, like your base ISO can be like 100, 250, 320, depending on the camera. It can be better to sacrifice noise reduction of shooting at a low ISO or overall sharpness for actually getting the photo or getting the composition. There are many different types of noises I won't go into, like read noise, shot noise, etc. Great, excellent resource is Photons to Photos. They have a lot of charts graphing all the specs for cameras where they test out like the photographic dynamic range, the noise, very many different things there. So if you're thinking about buying a camera and you're like, oh, I've heard that full frame is way less noisy than blah, 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 you know, you can compare the two cameras you might be checking out and say, huh, that's not a lot of dynamic range addition, or that's not a lot of noise reduction, or I can deal with the images when I look up a sample image of ISO blah, blah, blah from this camera. Just fine for me. There's film ISO as well. I don't know what ASA is, but I don't know anything about film other than like, yes, film sensitivity is the same concept, right? So you have like ISO 400, 800 film, etc. That's more sensitive to light from what I recall. Yeah. So I've done no film, but it is the same concept of you can shoot with different sensitivity film that allows you to shoot in lower condition light. But I'm not qualified to speak about film. Last base concept, again, from that triangle is shutter speed. So the amount of time that your camera shutter is exposed to the light coming from your optical system. So you have an image circle. Your lens is projecting a circle of light onto a square sensor. And it is the measure of how much light is reached from shutter open to shutter closed for, say, a 1 second exposure there. Two shutters that actually follow each other on most rolling or all rolling shutter cameras. There are some global sensor cameras. They come with some trade-offs as well. But for the most part, you'll be dealing with a rolling shutter camera, which has two shutters that are very quickly scanning across the frame, and it's reading kind of, it's exposing the camera just, or the sensor just in a little tiny tidbit. The shutters are chasing each other, which can lead to, in very high movement situations, like very fast sports or things like that, or dragonfly wings beating, rolling shutter artifacts, which is like, oh, I grabbed the right frame there, but then by the time that that little shutter moved a little bit faster, a little bit progressively down the frame, the dragonfly's wings turned a little bit. So you see these weird, I don't know if you've ever seen like a picture of propellers, and the propellers looked all like kind of messed up. It's just a digital artifact of reading out a camera sensor progressively from one side to the other, not fast enough. It does influence, shutter speed influences the amount of blurring or perceived motion that you have over the exposure, depending on how much light you are, if you're shooting with flash. And you might want to use a longer shutter speed for the effect of motion for water. You know, if you have a waterfall behind it and you use a long exposure, I'm sure you've seen it, rolling water, those beautiful photos, night photos, bioluminescence. If you're doing tripod mounted long shutter speeds, it's an option. It's also an option to do something called like multi-flash. So say I have a 5-second exposure, so open, and then 5 seconds later closed. If I have it set so my aperture is narrow enough, my camera is just not sensitive enough to light, or it's a dark room, and I pop the flash 5 times, I'll get like kind of like a quintuple exposure of me at each time the flash popped, all in one frame. So it's just another way for you to think about your camera is letting in light for however long the shutter is open, and you are free to play with how you creatively let the light hit the sensor, get exposed via your settings. Shooting with flash, if you have flash, diffusion is key to reducing specular highlights, which decrease the, oh yeah, and these are just some spiders, random Philly spiders. So if you don't have diffusion, what you'll get is very harsh highlights. So things that are shiny, you'll just have reduced resolution, you'll get specular reflections, and you will get photos that are much less sharp than if you have a diffusive element. You know, it's pretty much the same for a flash or not, which is just something that is transparent, but that is making it so the light isn't coming from a tiny source anymore, but it's illuminating a large sheet or something else, and it's as if the light is coming from a bigger source. So instead of me pointing a flashlight at, you know, anyone in the audience, you'll see a big harsh background as well, a kind of a shadow, you get more of a gentle, soft, uniform light, but also you really need diffusion for resolution. Whether or not you're using little LED lights or you're using a flash, you need diffusion. You want to, especially at macro, illuminate the subject from a relatively, to the size of the subject, large, uniform, kind of like as if a big cloudy sky or something else, by putting, a diffusive element around at like, 1x macro. If I have a tiny subject and I have a pretty big diffuser, it's big enough that like the light seems like it's just kind of surrounding it, giving you enough exposure and giving you not too much harshness from the light. But also the other thing is uniform diffusion, where it's perfectly uniform, or even a ring light will sometimes also lead to bland or uninteresting compositions if it's perfectly uniform. We want some directionality. You want to be able to play with shadows, highlights, anything like that creatively. So playing with light is super important. It's something that I need to continue doing, even though I do a little bit. But it's sometimes a thing that I'm like, I'm tired, I need to go to bed. I'm not going to like mess with the lights anymore. It's been 2 hours or something like that. So this is a mosquito that bit me. The stack isn't perfect, but even mosquitoes can be pretty fascinating. This is a very high-speed continuous shot just with my arm of the mosquito. This is an example of, I didn't have my diffuser with me, so I was using an older, tinier diffuser. And you can see it's a little bit harsh lighting. And it's a fine photo of this beetle, but I could have reduced some of the areas where you can see the flash kind of highlighted these areas and made it a little bit more smoother. Still want a little bit of this shadowiness right underneath, but a little bit more diffusion would have helped, or a larger diffuser would have helped here. Ambient and flash can be mixed, so you can have enough light in the scene to get some exposure, but you may just need a little bit more on the subject of your mushroom up front or whatever you're doing. You can mix the two with either supplementary LED or flash even, but then you get into the situation where you might need to color balance for two different spectrum. So you have different illuminants coming in with different colors. You might need to, in post-processing, deal with the fact that you have two different illuminants, and one side of the face might be rendered in a more blue tone versus the other a little bit more red if you're shooting at like, sunset, and then you use a very blue LED or a very blue flash. And flashes are usually at about, 5,500K as a measure of like their warmth, a little bit cool. But even those categories can be a little bit interesting once you dive into what's perceptual and what's physical. You can change all of those settings to kind of mix and blend those elements, so you should remember that. And this might seem deep, but there's a lot that I'm not covering. So like when you get to pairing microscope optics to sensors, what's the minimum resolvable detail? You get into things like the circle of confusion, airy disks, line pairs per millimeter. A lot of stuff you can totally get into, but maybe this is just to be like, hey, I'm making an excuse. I'm not covering everything poorly. This is a Lecnelula handheld stack from this spring. They're nice and hairy. This is a Copernopsis, and I think maybe I can claim at this moment that this might be the highest resolution photograph of a complete basidiomycete that has ever been taken, or ASCO, just because I know that I used a 0.45 numerical aperture objective, which is able to resolve well into the micrometer range, and knowing that this subject is, just a millimeter or so tall, and that I took a full stack of all of this, there's pretty much no way you can get higher resolution other than if my sensor had tinier pixels, I could have gotten technically a little bit better resolution because my sensor is mismatched to this microscope optics in terms of on the object side, I am producing details that are finer than my microscope, than my camera sensor can resolve. But for right now, this is probably like probably the highest resolution photo of an entire mushroom fruiting body. Obviously, this is only a millimeter tall, but there's again that Copernopsis stercorea on dung. You can see like those really interesting globose cells here. And the other cool thing is that when I look up photos of these globose cells, you can even see some fine, reticulation or ornamentation or something going on with those globose cells on the veil. You can kind of see it. I think it's deliquescing to some extent, like the cells are just kind of deteriorating into nothing with that auto-digesting thing that Copernopsis does. You can see spores on there. And And yeah, it's just kind of fun. It's really frustrating because when you're working with live fruiting bodies that are that tiny, they dehydrate in front of you. So they'll like just start sagging out of the frame, especially in Colorado. So that's something that I really want to work on. But I really liked it because it was an interesting view of seeing a complete tiny mushroom, right? Another thing when you're looking for lenses is they might have different rendering. So how a lens renders the out of focus elements, how a lens represents the colors that come through. Greater focal length again has more subject to background separation. Just evaluate it as a tool of expression that can be subjective, and some may satisfy your creative concerns. Again, when I said budget for lenses, it's not like you need a ton, but you want at least one lens if you buy like a camera, a modern camera, that isn't going to be just the kit lens often. You know, start with the kit lens, but you might get frustrated if you don't have some creative options with something that like affords, you know, a fast lens or a macro lens or something really good for portraits that you're excited about. If you really want to do portraits or like you want something very transportable with your friends and family, get something that excites you. Again, just out of focus rendering, f1.1, very wide aperture. You can see these are what are called bokeh or whatever. I don't really want to get into it too much. I don't spend too much time thinking about it other than like I want some amount, if I'm doing a shallow depth of field, of creaminess, a little bit less outlining if possible. But people obsess over this because you can get things like, oh, the outer ring is like a little bit too harsh, or I really like that because it's soap bubble bokeh, or the background is swirly because of these weird lenses that just happen to render like this, and I really love that, you know. People can get pretty obsessed. Another cheap option is you can adapt with mirrorless cameras vintage lenses to the mirrorless bodies because the flange to focal distance, the distance at which the lens focuses on an older film camera or DSLR is bigger. So there's enough space to put an adapter on and then have it still focus at the right distance. And those can be a really cheap option to get some very fantastic rendering, some vintage look, but not only just the vintage look, sometimes it's just like, that's pretty sharp. That's sharp enough. That's sharper than my phone was going to do in this situation. And it looks really good. So comparing f1.1 to f4 or so, you can see more depth of field in the tinier aperture. And again, the tiny versus the large. I don't know. These drawings are totally helpful, right? On the tiny on this one versus large aperture, much more subject separation, less sharp, more depth of field, but the background becomes a much more prominent part of the composition here. Okay, cool. I'm speeding through. That's good. So this is a little hawk moth, I think it was called. I just wanted to show you something with like some of the feathers or scales. This isn't a very close-up macro because I do have some photos of feathers, or sorry, scales for moths and butterflies, and they're a really brilliant subject you can take photos of. Oh yeah, it's right here. This was when I was testing out my 20x objective. I think this is just glue because I was just playing around. I wanted to see that some of these details here got rendered like these lines, and then some of the connecting tissue in between these lines on the feathers or the scales of the butterfly. So that let me know that this objective that I bought used, which is notoriously fragile, was still producing sharp enough images. So I needed to know, is this microscope objective good enough for my purposes, or did I just lose $300? And in this case, rendering was fine. There's a lot of contrast again. That's what I had mentioned before, is sometimes there's a subjective phenomenon. You want to make sure that you're seeing enough contrast and micro contrast in small areas. Again, butterflies, scales, wings, whatever you'd like to call it, or sorry, feathers. And then this was with a very high resolution objective, but I did it very fast style. I was just racking the focus manually on that device over there. But this is a moth. This is a moth eye with a 20x 0.75 numerical aperture objective, one of the sharpest objectives I have. There is a limit. We'll discuss that later when we get to microscopes, if we do. So the one thing you do want to take note of is modern cameras, including your phone, really want you to get the appropriate exposure. Now, there can be some places where it might seem wrong because of the fact that the camera is only so smart, right? So like I have a very dark subject here. Very dark subject. If there was something kind of bright or pretty reflective here, like some paper or some leaves, it would probably meter this where the subject is not bright enough because it's trying to expose to like 18% or like middle gray or something like that. It's just taking like an average of all the pixels and trying to get you something that looks to it exposed. Now, you can overcome this with things in the camera like spot exposure. You might say, hey, I want you to automatically calculate the exposure based on just the information on the pixels in this window. So this is something I still struggle with for dark subjects, is balancing the amount of being able to get enough detail. And I think I did get enough detail on this subject without making the lighting look too harsh. But just being in mind of what's in your frame will dictate what the subject in the photo will look like and how your camera meters it. But it really does want to help you. You can give it like little guidelines like, oh, I only want to go to this ISO, or I only want to go to this minimum shutter speed, because I know hand holding, I'm not going to be able to get below, depending on focal length, 1/50 seconds. If I go too slow, if I go to a half-second exposure, it's going to pick up all of my movement. So I'm like, don't go there. I want you to work within these limitations, but you balance all of it. It's a lot nicer in terms of burden off of you than film. It's a lot more forgiving. And you have things like adjusting the exposure with exposure compensation. You have things like adjusting your flash power, adjusting your aperture, ISO manually, but the camera can take a lot of it. So this is just kind of interesting because this is what got me into microscope optics. I was in California. I had my 4x AmScope objective, which is like a $20 microscope objective. And all you need to do for a microscope objective, if it's a finite microscope objective, is have an empty tube between the lens and the sensor, and you don't need any other optics, and it'll produce an image when it's placed at the right distance. So I just brought this $20 objective, which is actually kind of famous for being pretty decent for a $20 objective. And this Phelodon Niger, I think, Banker ACA, kind of related to some of the Hidnellum and the Bankera and the Phelodon. When I looked with a 4x objective, having very little experience on how to do this, so it's not perfect, I was surprised to actually start seeing spores in clumps of 4 on this hymenophore. So I could actually start to see, spores and handheld, right? Like I'm just taking a picture of this with my flash on the side and looking at the photo, the mushrooms that are on the table. And I was like, that's pretty awesome, because otherwise the story kind of ends here for you, right? It's like, yep, there are tiny little structures that are impossible to see. So I was interested in exploring that story more. This is where you can see where I did not go slowly enough. So there's these bands of focus that are not in focus. But on this other mushroom, I don't remember what it was, I can pretty clearly see with this 4x objective, is a basidiole, and there are 4 basidia, or 4 spores on this basidiole, which is pretty cool, right? Like I'm actually imaging spores, and I'm using almost no equipment, a $20 lens and my camera, and like a 3D printed adapter and a flash, pretty much as low as you can go. When I started getting into some studio photography with microscopes and of spores, I did a spore print on a very old CPU. So these features are like 5 microns big or so. So very, very tiny, but the same kind of technology that powers your phones or things at your computer. It is a wafer. And these are Satharella candoleana, or Candoelomyces candoleanus now, I think. These spores are kind of interesting because as spores dry, they kind of shrink up, but they're pretty long. So not only did it shrink up, as in there's a sunken feature that you see sometimes when I'm taking like photos of psilocybin, but it's so long that it also kind of folded into a little bean or a taco that's like there. And the Candoelomyces candoleanus spores are just a little bit longer than some of the others that are like, 5 by 12 or something micrometers. But yeah, this is a stack of like 50 photos or something of a CPU. And I just did a spore print on the CPU because I was like, kind of fun to compare feature size, right? And also kind of fun when you think about it, because like the amount of genetic information on here and like what this can become and how miniaturized this is versus, our best technology in 1983 are these gigantic chunky features. That's pretty cool when you just kind of think about the scale continuing to go down and down. Here's another one, I think shot with a different objective, but again, just a thicker spore print where you can see the spores and you can see very, very, very tiny features on the CPU. Optical aberrations, I'll kind of go through really quickly since we don't need to go deep into them, but just be aware if you're looking for a lens, reviews will mention them, and this is what they mean. It can be very relevant because sometimes optical aberrations can ruin a photo. So you have spherical, you have chromatic aberrations of linear chromatic and transverse. You have coma, which I believe is when a feature like a point of light like this has like a little bit of a streaking, and I think that's caused by magnification kind of changing depending on where you are in the field of view. Lenses have several elements in many different groups to correct for this, and basically make up the limitations of trying to use a curved surface to get light into our sensor. And certain lenses might pass certain wavelengths of light, but also some lenses are designated apochromatic. This can come into relevance with microscope objectives, but even camera lenses. The most highly corrected for the different things that you want to do in terms of aberrations are apochromatic lenses. This is Lacrimaria lacrimabunda that I finally saw this year. I didn't know that we had it fairly common. This was at 3 Mile Creek, I think. Unfortunately, I didn't get time because the cool thing is that they're called the Weeping Widow because there's some exudate that comes down on the gills that you can see from the gills, which are really show some stunning for some stunning photos. I only had time at that day for a quick photo of it, just showing some of the nice texture on it. And it's still a pretty mushroom anyhow. This is Thelaphora palmatus, the stinking earth fan. This is just a quick stack out with Joe and Alex. I just like often, getting enough resolution that I can see the spore deposit here. You can see some brown spore mass, the color of the spores. And this is next to moths. So this isn't, a gigantic mushroom, but it's decently small, but not tiny. Here's an example of chromatic aberration, and the, let's see, lateral chromatic aberrations will often show as in the foreground out of focus highlights, you'll see this purple or pinkish fringing, and in the background, you'll see this greenish haze coming in. So it often happens on very high contrast scenes is where you'll see chromatic aberrations come in. And I was shooting very wide open, which on this lens definitely shows a lot of aberrations, some of which you can correct out. Again, just to quickly define it, here's the two types of chromatic aberrations. Here's an ideal system when all the colors of light are focused on the exact same image plane perfectly, and we're reproducing an image of a ring. In 2, we have only lateral chromatic aberrations. So we see different wavelengths of light, blue versus green versus red, are mismatched to focus directly on the sensor plane. So that's why in the last image, out of focus highlights had different colors on them, which isn't a true representation of what's going on. And the last one is, axial for 2. And then last one is lateral, where you can kind of get a rainbow or haloing, especially, I think the other name for it is transverse chromatic aberrations towards the edges of the scene. Last one that's relevant, especially for microscope objectives, is spherical aberrations. And this is just to introduce you to, we're trying to get around a lot of physics concepts to be able to take photos, right? And we have to use a curved surface to focus light into our sensor plane. And by using a curved surface without any corrections for a simple lens, we're not going to get all of these light rays refracted to the exact point of the sensor. And that can cause blurriness, which is why modern lenses will have many different elements to try to reduce this. I just hear echo now. Oh, went away maybe. So here's some Chlorociboria. I was really excited because I hadn't, oh, it's fine. I was really excited because I hadn't seen the fruiting bodies. And I was out with Alex, I think, and he's showed me that there's some actual fruiting bodies out here. Really fun to get some tiny photos of them, even though they weren't really big and they didn't show, kind of like a bigger features. But they are also very fragile. I dropped it once and it started drying out too. So they look a lot less picturesque after some time. But I played with framing. I think this I accidentally took at ISO 400, which I usually don't do for these macros because I can control all the elements. But you can see more graininess in this photo than some of the others. Another frame of the Chlorociboria and another view. And these are some stacking artifacts, which we won't cover, but stacking in and of itself using the program is an art in and of itself. Now, just like to kind of wrap that part up, sharpness is a subjective psychological phenomena. You can measure some things like minimum transmissible frequency, and you can get charts for like kind of the supposed sharpness of a lens, but there are psychological factors at play. Particular lenses can have a sharpest aperture. So each of my lenses has a sharpest point. It's resolving the finest details. And often that'll be 1 or 2 stops below the very widest aperture because we're getting rid of some of the chromatic aberrations that are influencing the photo and making it blurry or not look that great. But each lens has a sharpest aperture. And when I'm stacking, I want to make sure that I'm using the sharpest aperture for each of my lenses because that will give me the best photo to come out of it. It's not the end all and be all of photography. It can be very important in macro and extreme macro, but you can take amazing photos and amazing compositions even at macro without a very sharp lens. Critical focus or the most in focus part can be a transition between in and out of focus. But then some compositions demand certain things, like an insect wants its eyes to be in focus because otherwise it looks a little bit weird or eerie to take a photo of an insect and the eyes aren't in focus. Things like the leading edge of a mushroom. You want the leading elements at the front of your photos to be in focus. So I've taken a bunch of photos and like, oh, the leading edge wasn't really in focus. It's an okay photo, but it's like a little bit easier on the eyes, and like the composition just works a little bit better if the elements all the way up front, like the leading edge of your subject, is in focus. Here's a little cephaloid basidiomycete. Don't know what it is. I think I got a small suggestion, but these were tiny. So this was, a pine needle, right? And it was just a tiny thing attached to some wood. I'm sorry, some roots. I wasn't sure if the roots were dying or not, but it was in the ground, some exposed roots, and I saw this tiny cephaloid basidio growing. Illumination, again, you can use the sun, you can use continuous, which is also the sun, or LED, or tungsten, etc. lights at home. You can use flash with diffusion. Flash can freeze motion because, again, if your exposure is only coming from the flash and your flash is only open for like 1/16,000th of a second, that's how sports photography can happen too. You're going to get a really crisp photo because how much is my hand moving in 1/16,000th of a second, even if I'm moving it fast? Almost nothing in terms of like what's showing up on your sensor. Other thing is you want high color rendering index sources, although color rendering index as a measure isn't really very true or the whole story in and of itself. But if you're buying LED lights, you do want to make sure that their CRI is like claimed to be at least above 95, even if it's a flawed measurement CRI, because otherwise you're going to get into situations where colors just won't look good or right, and they're going to be difficult to correct. Working with flash, you're able to modify the amount of light coming to the exposure from the scene from ambient versus the flash. You can exclude all light from the ambient light and only use the flashlight. It's specified either in manual power or through the lens metering. So you can do through the lens metering, takes a pre-flash, a tiny fraction of a second before the photo fires. You won't ever notice it, but it tries to determine, I need this flash power to properly expose my scene. And then you can work with that and then do a little offset. And that's how you can vary the flash power without having to enter in 1/32, 128, 1/32, 1/256, etc. I often just kind of have a feel for if I'm working at 1x, 2x, 5x. This is the amount of flash power with my diffuser that I need to start with. Take a photo, a little bit underexposed, let me dial it up or down. Lower powers also have shorter durations, which is T0.1 time, where the amount of energy is decayed to 10% of the original flash energy over this period. And that means you're freezing motion better. When you get to 101 full power flash, you can have a pretty long flash. The flash is on for a pretty long period. And if you're illuminating your sensor for a pretty long period, that does what to motion? It makes it apparent. So shorter durations are important. If you're hand-holding tiny subjects, you want to use lower amounts of flash power, also because your recycle time will be faster. You can take more flash. Again, this is just, if you're ever buying flashes, you might want to look for the true time, which is T0.1, where the flash is actually firing for, to know what is dominating the amount of light coming into your scene. This is another of the Copernopsis stercoria. Apparently, here's another thing, y'all. You can collect dung in the wood and then have it growing on your windowsill at home to make tiny mushrooms. I don't know if I have the link in here. I think I wanted to, but Alfred DH of, I think, Copriphilus fungi, the group, he's like, yeah, I released a paper, like a small like how-to guide on how to collect little dung and take it home and then just see the fluctuation of various species that will start growing if you keep this dung wet on your windowsill. So that's great, right? It's perfect for like the coffee table. This is again the Copernopsis stercoria. I was excited, even though I didn't do too much retouching, to get a little bit of this, the spore mass deposit in little beads going down. Although there are some issues with this photo. Magnification, again, when you do macro, you'll hear magnification, which is specified as on-sensor magnification. So if my sensor is 15 millimeters high, I have a subject that's 1 millimeter in real life, and I'm 1:1, it's going to take up 1 millimeter of the sensor, or in the original image, no matter blow it up, a 15th of it. Say my subject is 5 millimeters and I do 3:1, that would cover my entire sensor. So the photo that comes out, here, if we think about the magnification that's like being shown here, it's empty magnification at some point, but it's just a measure of how filled your frame is by the subject that you're looking at. So biggest thing is get out and play. You can figure these things out empirically, but just like riding a bike, using your non-dominant hand, it's going to be goofy. I really didn't think that I'd have some intuitive sense of like how to shape a scene the way I want to for some of these things. And it's getting easier. Play with light. You can make amazing compositions because we all have different ideas in our head. We all have different life experiences. We all have different stories we want to tell. Photography can't just be like homogenized and like the things that you see on Facebook as like the most dreamy photo that all has the exact same look. You'll start to get a feel of what you're interested in exploring. It's also just easier after you start going. This is again that Copernopsis stercorea. I have a feeling I'm going to be spending a lot of time as long as these are growing in my fridge / I'll take them out. But this is a 3.7x objective. You can see those globose veil cells, and you can see it's just a little fuzzy guy. Very cute. Little rant is that I think Facebook and algorithms are influencing and distorting culture on many different levels. It especially sucks for photography and video and just like, the way we relate to each other. But you hear a lot about like machine learning or AI, and the more, apparent one is AI images. However, we've always been dealing with machine learning in terms of the suggestion algorithm of Facebook. I remember people complaining way back when, man, I used to see my friends' feeds, every now and then, or I used to see things in chronological order. And now it's all what's going to get you on the platform for the longest, which isn't necessarily going to align with what is, letting creativity flourish, what is appreciating certain types of stories, certain types of compositions. It often gets homogenized into what is like, what looks exactly the same, and that's really, I don't think, a good thing for culture in general. I think we get that for the way that people interact with each other about Facebook on other issues. Anything that is, reactionary, going to make you stay on the platform, click it, be outraged, or just like kind of get you being fed baby food in terms of the algorithm, it's going to adjust for maximizing a different thing than cherishing creativity, connectedness, sharing, etc. Because there's also a lot of weird penalties on Facebook. Like Facebook will make your links not show up as often to friends if you include a link to off the website. Facebook definitely will get you into little like algorithmic holes. But anyway, find things that you want to do differently. And again, photography can't be completely explored. It can't be just whatever photos that you see in whatever really big best photograph, or the macro group on Facebook. There's a lot more stories to be told. How should you shoot? Preferably not always full auto, eventually, if you feel comfortable, or however you want to shoot. I'm not going to shade anyone. But a lot of time I spend time in aperture priority, which means I can change the aperture, I can change the depth of field, and the camera is dealing with all the other aspects to get me good exposure, and I'll just tweak it, or full manual, especially when you're doing high magnification or macro. So make creative choices that the scene demands. Play with shadows, play with it, sense of motion. Again, you can take photos with your cell phone. Just think about something you want to depict, play with it, see how you can get it closer to what you want to depict. So equipment I bring, I guess I could just kind of show it. I'm not sure how this is going to show up on the Zoom. Maybe I'll carry it over. So I just would recommend if you do end up getting an actual camera, that you don't get a camera backpack, because they're really expensive. And I mean, you can, but they are really expensive and they're not as ergonomic as a hiking backpack. So I finally bought a real hiking backpack, which, has a little bit of like frame support and backpack support. And I keep all of my things in, now these can be expensive too, except this one was like 16 bucks since I went with a cheap one, little insert packs for your gear. So I have my lenses in here. I bring my 2.5 to 5x Laowa lens, which is an excellent macro lens that is pretty affordable, about 300 bucks used, which is pretty good for something that's going that high. I bring my Lomo 3.7x microscope objective mounted to an empty 3D printed tube, which I printed. And this outresolves my $300 macro lens. So it's better corrected for aberrations. And this microscope objective costs $1. So that's kind of neat, right? If I had known, maybe I wouldn't have gotten the other one. I bring my flash. Well, I'll often bring this 8200 flash, which outputs high enough power that at the 5x, I'm not struggling with recycle time because I'm taking high-speed continuous flash. And other than that, I will bring my favorite 2x. Oh, whoops. Hopefully y'all could have seen some of that. My favorite 2x lens, which is a Laowa lens. And then I might bring 1 or 2 other lenses if I just want to take photos of the people I'm with, or I want something a little bit wider. It really depends on what I'm doing that day. Sometimes I'm really determined to get a specific photo of a mushroom. and I'm just going to bring my macro lenses. Sometimes I'm not going to do any macro, and I just want to take photos of my friends while I'm out. So choose wisely, but a real backpack is infinitely better, I'd say, than a camera backpack. I have an A6700 now. I used to have the A6400. There was no problem with the A6400 other than the buffer depth. It would take a long time to recycle. So that's about it. UV lights, also good to bring. I didn't upload a graph, but you can bring several UV lights and you can do cool things with stacking. You can take cool photos in UV on your phone. I have to emphasize that. You can take great photos. You just need to adjust the brightness setting on your phone or adjust the shutter speed to get what you want to look out of it. But you can take really cool, compelling compositions that way. Does autofocus matter? Not for 1x plus macro, even though sometimes it can help. It will be extremely important to you for videography, commercial photography, if you don't want to think about focus. But for macro and ultra macro, it becomes increasingly diminishingly important. RAW versus JPEG, most cameras can output both, sometimes with a frame rate penalty, so it can only write to the card so fast. If you include the JPEG or the RAW file as well, you will get a little bit more creative ability to do better than the JPEG did. So sometimes I hear people think like, oh, this photo is unedited. It came out of my camera. But the real thing is, or out of my phone or my camera, your camera and your phone are applying edits to the sensor information that's coming in. So there's no unedited photo if you're just getting the straight out of camera JPEG. It's just giving its automatic judgment of what the scene should look like. So after a while, you start to get an idea of, I don't want to depict it like that. I want this, right? And I just included the Aurora photos because they were, fairly easy to edit in RAW to get some color and to go where I wanted with them. And because, again, the exposure and everything else was something I was pretty familiar with from macro photography, it wasn't too hard to head up to Guanella Pass to take some photos because I was like, okay, at least I'm not struggling with, why is this so dark? I have no idea why this is so dark. Okay, I need to change the setting. Not a big deal. Free software for editing RAW is Darktable. It's extremely difficult in a way with the UI. So, the company who should not be mentioned that everyone knows for RAW development, because they're an evil company, you're welcome to use them, of course. It's a lot more fun and, more intuitive user interface. But Darktable is really excellent because it's free and because the people nerd out so hard on how the photos should be developed versus if it's referring to like perceptual aspects of photography, because the colors and everything else related to perception rather than just a pure representation of reality. Again, that's something that's interesting is I was purity resistant at first. I was like, I always want my photos not to be too oversaturated. And that's fine. And I do still not want my photos to only be very oversaturated or all have that HDR look that was really, really popular in 2016 onwards, right? But interestingly enough, you can go too hard on like not putting in color because I've heard, and I'm not sure if this is true, that when they studied it, that we remember colors as less saturated than when we actually saw them the first time. Like, so when you compared actual experience to what the people recalled it as. So to some extent, you're not faithfully exactly recreating reality here, right? There is artistic merit here. There is also color grading. So you might be ascribing to certain aspects of color theory to give a certain mood or look to your thing, like videos are color graded. But just remember, you do want some creative leeway here, and your job is not perfectly to reconstruct reality as it was seen from the lens, because again, everything has been edited. Just a few more Aurora things. One method I shoot with is I just select the aperture that's appropriate for artistic emphasis, the sharpness that I need, and I illuminate it. I test it with either my flash or otherwise. I take a test shot. I look at that test shot. I replay it. And I say, is this too dark? Is this too light? Is the thing that I'm interested in too dark or too light? What do I need to adjust? I just make sure that there's no clipping so I can recover all the information, highlights or shadows. I modify the illumination position to try to tell a story I want. I take a stack or a single photo. I might bracket. So I might take an exposure that's a little darker, a little bit lighter, and see what I want to do later when I go back home. But try different framing. You need, composition I won't go into, but everything is available to you. Leading lines, subframes, proportions, perspective, sense of scale. This is again that Pandora, quote unquote, maybe just some entomopathogenic fungi on wood. And this thing is definitely fascinating to me. I really wish I wouldn't have crushed it. But I was trying to take photos with my highest resolution objective, which has a 1 millimeter working distance. So it needs to be 1 millimeter away from the subject. And I just turned it and I was like, oh, that just crushed it. So, oh well. We'll do UV in a sec, I think. I'm getting a little short on time. This is, again, that Pandora, just some structures. I couldn't tell you what any of these structures are. Very ignorant outside of basidiomycetes. And I don't even know what this is, where this lands. Cell phones are a-okay. One of the main things about cell phones, bring supplementary lighting because you're not always going to have enough light to get the photo you want. You can bring little small lights and it can help immensely. I often shoot for when I'm doing, this isn't a cell phone photo, but when I'm doing photos that are close up, I just want some amount of detail, you know, resolved of the microstructures of the hymenophore. And you can see some detail there of the microstructures. Better illuminated photos will allow you to lower your ISO, which allow you less noise, sharper photos. Supplementary lenses, you can put a Belomo loop, a jeweler's loop, or any other things on your cell phone and get higher magnification. Macro photography is, again, one-to-one subjects. Sharp lenses can produce compelling macro, but you have to work around it. You have to be a better artist, basically, to get a composition that's good if your lens is not sharp at all. Sometimes it's a little bit easier if your lens is really sharp. You know, your composition may suffer, but it's still interesting to some extent. Play with studio macro or just even non-super close up, but just play with studio photography. When you get home, you can take photos in a controlled environment and you're not sweating in the field because it's like 7 p.m. and you got to go home and it's raining or you just can't figure out what you need to do. You can have like a week to live with something. You're good. Cheap macro lenses. Laowa makes really cheap lenses. My first real lens was a 90 millimeter Sony f2.8 macro. It cost like $600 used, and it was like $1,200 new. I sold that so I could buy these two. You know, I didn't have enough money to buy all of them. I do miss autofocus for portraiture. It was a really creamy rendering. Sometimes I'm like, man, I kind of miss it. But there are options. Above 5x, really custom solutions are best with microscope objectives. Rather than there's a $1,300 like Laowa Argonaut. You can get better resolution by purchasing microscope objectives. I'm super happy to help you. Photomacrography.net, other things like that. Also, old school enlarger lenses, darkroom equipment can be used and can make excellent macro lenses. Sometimes they're referred to as accidental macro lenses. You take that lens and sometimes in certain situations you have a taking lens behind it and you use bellows and you can get insanely sharp macros with a, you know, used to be a little bit cheaper, but cheap enough darkroom enlarging lenses, things like that. Reversing a regular lens makes it also focus closely and represent the subject high. So if you get an adapter, you can take your lens and go backwards, and at the expense of, you know, less light, a smaller effective aperture, you can start getting closer up. You can also take a regular lens and instead, if it mounts here, if you just add empty tubes and have the lens further out, you lose infinity focus, but you can focus really close up and you get a bigger picture of something. So those are two almost free ways, reversing a lens or just adding a tube to get closer up to a subject when you're working with an actual camera. Again, you can also use diopters, which I forgot to bring, which are like little add-on lenses that you just clip on. You can stack them. They're available for all of this to get what magnification you're going to get at. A lot of these techniques may reduce your working distance, to some extent even reduce the working distance. You know, I was a 1 millimeter is the closest I can focus or was where I'm focusing. Now, if I extend the tube a little bit more, now the theoretical focus distance is behind the front element of the lens. There's no way to take a photo, right? So there is a limit to some extent. You can't get infinite magnification this way. This was a little micro mineral. So this is cuprite and dilaphosite. This was taken with like a 3.7x objective. This one right here, $60. Pretty cool. I like it. And then this was taken with a much higher resolution, 0.42 numerical aperture, 20x Mitutoyo objective, which are kind of like the Cadillac in some ways of objectives for air work because for photomacrography, because they have very long working distances while maintaining a decently high numerical aperture. And they're apochromatic, so there aren't chromatic aberrations in this image for the most part. Here's a Scutelinea that I found a little while ago. I was excited to do a handheld, or I did the stack on there with the 3.7x, I think the 3.7x. I was just excited to be able to see some details like spores on the eyelashes, eyelash cup fungus. Pretty rewarding. Focus stacking, finally. Sorry if it took too long. Focus stacking is the concept of compositing multiple images at small incremental planes of focus via software to create a composite image with a greater depth of field. This is a focus stacked image. I hate this image because it's like a weird, creepy like thing riding it, but it is a focus stacked. And the reason I did this was because there was not a lot of light. I think the lights off were in the ceramic studio. The only way I could get a shutter speed that wasn't going to be shaky, if I had stopped my lens down to try to get the bunny and the boy in, it was going to be too dark for me to take a sharp photo of this without jacking up my ISO. So I just shot at my widest or second to widest aperture or so. And there's a stack of 21 photos composited. And it looks like a regular photo. Maintained the back depth of field. It looks normal. Zarine Stacker is one piece of software written by Rick. Excellent. Helicon Stacker is another. Affinity is another one. Photomacrography.net is again a great resource. High-speed continuous stacking affords a lot of freedom. That's how I shoot usually. And again, one thing to keep in mind if you do end up getting into stacking is that your shutter will have a certain life, but you shouldn't really worry about that too much. You should worry more about taking photos because it is something that can be repaired for, you know, $300-400. But 100K to 250K, sometimes you might fail on like consumer level cameras at about 250K actuations. I got $100,000 shutter actuations on my A6400, and it's going to be, you know, I'm getting rid of it to sell it, but it's still going strong. In-body stacking is another thing. Instead of you manually racking the focus ring with an autofocus lens in the right body, it can do it for you. So you can set your camera up on a tripod, aim at the scene, autofocus onto the first point, say I want to take 40 photos of that, and it'll take the 40 photos for you, and you can composite them into a focus stacked image yourself instead of doing the handheld stuff as well. So focus stacking demo, I won't do a full demo, but I will open up Helicon. But in the interest of time, I just want to show you what theoretically, I've got my light, I've got my camera. I turn on my flash. At some point, modeling light is on. One sec. We'll see if it goes with the flash or not. And if it doesn't work with the flash, that's okay because you'll hear the shutter. I'm just giving you an idea of what I do when I'm standing there. Come on. Home. Home. E. Okay. There we go. So if I change my FPS, I'm high-speed continuous. Here, for people on Zoom, I guess maybe this will be seizure warning. Pretending I'm looking at this little back of this flashlight. I have my flash mounted here. I have a diffuser, which is a home-built diffuser. I don't have it right here. This isn't a macro lens, but if it was a macro lens, I'd be doing the same thing. I have my flash mounted here, and what I do is I just go, I make sure my framing is good. I take one photo, I go in, I make sure the exposure looks fine. My flash setting doesn't need altering. I'll alter my flash setting if I need, and I'll go. Oh, and my SD card is out of space, so that's why it stopped. But it would keep going basically at 11 frames per second until I take a composite of all those images, and then we'll go into Helicon right now. So let me know if the Zoom is able to see Helicon. So I'm going to discard these, and I'm going to show you just what the stack would look like from our previous scene. Is this sharing on Zoom? Are you still on Zoom, Joe? Okay, cool. So in Helicon, pretend I had taken a picture of that microscope objective with the ruler to give you an idea of the depth of field. I can change some parameters, which are important. I can change the focus stacking method. But the most interesting thing I would say is that once you start going, it develops a map and adds all of those focus planes continually. In this case, 125 photos that I just took by racking the focus. And this is, again, like about how fast I'm changing very slowly the focus while it's going there to capture each of these images. But that's about it in terms of how you do the focus stacking itself. It's pretty simple. You get images at each plane. You want to make sure that it's continuous. You want to make sure your lighting is going to be the same throughout all. And you stack them in here. You do have to deal with composition, and sometimes there are things like substacks that you could take. So I could have stacked up to like just the microscope objective and combined it with a different one. But it's trying to do its best to figure out what is the highest contrast feature and what I want to display. So this is just an example of you run Helicon by just loading up the files, get all of yours in, and then you play around with it. This is again a Copernopsis. And you can see how annoying this is, that even in the time that I tried to photograph it, it started going pretty limp, and like I had to hang it upside down. It really sucks to try to take photos of the tiny stuff. UV photography, and we'll see if we get time for photomacrography, but we'll at least cover UV. UV photography is using a UV flashlight. I will I don't have the image here. Could try to pop it in at the end if we need it, but there's some good recommendations for cheap UV flashlights. Some of the cheaper brands right now are putting out higher power at the most high level ones for like $40 than some of the more expensive ones. But your UV light will be basically shining on. You need to use all the principles that we've discussed before. You want enough exposure on there for the shutter speed. Either you use a tripod and you let it sit there for like a 1 second or 2 second exposure, or what I do, and this needs some touch up, but this was a stack of a cricket where I just racked the focus really quickly through the cricket and then composited the photos. So because I was able to use a wider aperture, because I didn't need to have the entire cricket in focus from one photo, I did a composite, it allowed me to actually high-speed continuous stack a UV photo. So that's something that I find really interesting to do. Here's a big rock, although the sense of scale is hard to see with a lichen on it. This was just me documenting. Again, there's no tripod available, so I was able to at least document that this has a really interesting like green highlight on it, and this other wood had this interesting other red highlight on it in Philly. This is a stack in studio at home, or this might be just one photo. This is one photo. This is Hypholoma. Hypholoma, if you ever see Hypholoma, definitely get out the UV lights. The cystidia are glowing. And I was sad that I didn't find any fresh Hypholoma that coincided when I had some free time on the weekends to try to reshoot this, because I could do a lot better. But that's also part of photography, is figuring out what you want to do differently and what you get excited about. Copernopsis section Lanatule. This is the Copernopsis that I was very curious about. Like, this fresh stem right here just kind of seems like just generally glowing a little bit, but not really bright green like the dried material. So I'm very curious as to why once it dries, it kind of gets that like saturation of the glowing. Insects, again, this is a crab spider under 365 nanometers UV. If you're getting a UV light, you want to make sure it has this filter on the front that blocks out a lot of the ambient light from the photo, from the LED to reach the photo. This is, again, some stacks, but just some leaf that was very pretty with the chlorophyll glowing. This is a really pretty lichen that I had seen. And sometimes I did notice the stacking software does struggle with some of the UV photos, but again, I think you can adjust some settings and go around that. One thing that is fun about the high-speed stacking handheld, or even with a tripod, is that you can mix, right? So this is getting exposure from the sunlight, just when we're out at Tolland, and this Cortinarius glowed pretty brilliantly at the green here. So I'm able to see both elements here at the same time, and I can mix them as I want by changing some settings to get less of this like ambient light or more of this ambient light. But yeah, just play around for sure. This isn't bioluminescent, it's just random Copernopsis. Bioluminescence you can also find. I found one tiny mycelium strand in my tackle box, because what I did was I wanted to set myself up to get the most amount of light in my sensor and then hunt around to find if I could find something that was bioluminescent. So I took a photo at f1.1, my very widest aperture on one of my wider lenses to some extent, and I set my ISO up to the very max, so very grainy photo, but I don't care because I'm just hunting for that like hint of light. And then I do a really long 30-second exposure. 30 seconds of camera time open. I found one strand that was glowing, but then by the time I tried to find that strand again, I couldn't see any more glow because it was just a mess of like random junk. I couldn't find it again. So I'd love to continue doing this, but that's a technique basically thinking about bioluminescence. I need to try to first like hunt for it. I just want to even see if I can see anything by jacking up the sensitivity to light that my camera is getting. So it is about 9. I'll continue. Feel free to, if you have obligations, go. I'll try to speed through the microscope optics. I tried to keep the stuff that was maybe a little bit cooler, like easier accessible at the beginning, but we'll go into it. Microscope objectives are lenses of differing designs, affording higher magnification than standard macro lenses. Microscope systems will be either infinity corrected or finite conjugate. Here is some spores, some psilocybe spores. Super excited just to be able to see, and I don't really care specifically about the subject, but psilocybe, but like they're very high contrast, so it's very easy to take photos of compared to white spores, which were pretty difficult unless I put them on a different background. I was excited to see some of the younger spores lacked pigmentation, and they seem to be coming out of the gill flesh. again, just kind of confirming, I found like the mushroom wasn't very pigmented. It was a little bit immature, but you can see lighter and darker spores. I was also excited to see the little dry divot there, and then the apiculus on one end, and then the germ pore, this little divot right here, and then an apiculus. So I was blown away. This is a $60 microscope objective, right? I was getting high enough resolution photos to be able to take a nice stack and start doing reflected light, which is not usually what you do with microscopy. Usually you're doing transmitted light and taking optical sections of like the plane throughout the mushroom or the spores. Let's go back here, enter. This is my super most excited find, I think, or I didn't even find it. Somebody on my foray found it, but I saw it last year once for the first time. It's Sheminixia. It's actually Lexinum, pretty much. It's more close. It's in Boletaceae, I believe. Yeah, it is in Boletaceae, and it's related to Lexinum. And these have this beautiful, very saturated, this is just as beautiful in real life, blue staining on the outside of this, you know? And when you get in there, and I took a quick stack, I didn't get a chance to take a really high resolution stack. You can see the actual ornamentation on these spores, these long ridges, and then at the edge of them, I don't know if I have a good photo of it, but the edges look like a star repeating pattern that's like going down there. And there are pretty large spores, so they're easier to photograph than others. They're more bolete-sized spores. But I was also curious when I had the material, because I didn't have time. Again, I'm just trying to do this in my free time, you know, go hiking, take photos, and then spend an hour before I go to bed. I was curious handheld what I could do. So even handheld, you can start to resolve some of the features for sure. And I think I have some photos that I'm not trying to share in here. Not that it's a problem, but non-perfect ones I didn't select out. But you can start to see the features, even handheld, high-speed continuous stacking like I just showed you. You can start to see less mature spores, darker spores, and you can start to kind of like mentally conceptualize just the distribution of the fertile structure of the hymenophore. In this case, it's a secotioid, so it's not forming gills, but these are like kind of interconnected things on here. And again, even with like the 3.7x objective, you can see a basidiole with the clumps of 4 spores at the edge on this very immature specimen. And again, clumps of 4. So I just find that neat, right? Like I didn't really think that it would be so easy or accessible to just try to take even rough stacks of this kind of stuff. And it's kind of like a whole nother world of detail to go into. Again, I did take it to the final conclusion, which was I handheld stacked with a 50x microscope objective. And this was just 3 photos consecutive, 2 or 3 photos. But it was enough, you know, with a 50x microscope objective and a plane of focus that like, I think the numerical aperture was 0.55. So it's like 1 micrometer of resolution and under a micrometer of resolution, the plane of focus is like about like a micrometer. So 1/1000th of a millimeter. But even in that, because the camera firing just fast enough, by fate, you know, two frames line up just enough to stack. And I can see, you know, the apiculus, I can see some of the ridges, and I can see the general shape of the spore. And that's just something that I was doing right before bed. It just was me with the flash, with some diffusion on the table, just kind of like rocking a tiny bit back and forth. It barely need to rock because like your hand motions are enough to, you know, jiggle the plane of focus. But that's pretty cool that like, even if it's not an award-winning photo, I can inspect what something looks like at the microscopic level. Finite versus infinite, and this is relevant to microscopy as well. Finite conjugate objectives will create a virtual image at a certain distance from the shoulder of the objective. So the shoulder being this like little mounting flange. In this case, a 160 millimeter finite conjugate objective will project an image at about 18 millimeters back here, but 150 millimeters from the shoulder of the objective, there's an in-focus image available to you. Infinite objectives, however, require a tube lens or something to because the infinite conjugate objectives, infinitely corrected objectives do not project a focused image out at a certain distance. They send parallel beams of infinitely focused like light rays out. You need another lens focused to infinity to try to look at that image that is being projected by the microscope objective. So you need a tube lens. In my case, I use often this Nikon telephoto because I can change framing a little bit. But there are also little enlarging lenses, the Raynox DCR 250 and 150 are like macro add-on lenses. They make pretty excellent tube lenses. So with just a microscope objective that is infinite, a $50 adapter, and by placing the tube lens a certain distance from the plane of focus, so it is focused to infinity, you can test it by looking at the moon and like modifying that little lens. That lens is focused to infinity. Slap on a microscope optic on the other side of it, and you've got a focused image on your sensor of using the infinite conjugate, infinity corrected microscope optics. The reason that infinity corrected microscope optics became popular is because they allow for any number of optically flat elements to be placed in the infinite space. So this is infinite space. So they're infinite rays focused, not focused to a point, but rather just parallel rays coming out of the back of the microscope objective. And you can place polarizers, you can place differential interference contrast prisms in there. You can do beam splitters if you want episcopic illumination. You can do a lot more with them. That's why they became more popular without having a penalty on image quality. Thought it was mushrooms in the packet. So yeah, that is kind of the basics of the microscope objectives. The one thing is the focal length of your tube lens will dictate the final magnification of the infinity corrected objective. So different systems are designed for different focal lengths. So Olympus is like 180, I think. Nikon is usually 200 millimeter. So again, there's a telephoto lens up here that goes 80 to 200. If I change it from 200 to 100, I'm getting half the magnification that's rated on the camera objective, or sorry, the microscope objective, which can be useful. Or if I go to a 300 millimeter when it was designed for 200, I get the ratio of 3 to 2. So I get 1.5x. So if this was saying, oh, on sensor, I'm supposed to get 50x, and I use half the focal length tube lens that I do, 100 versus 200, I'll get 25x on sensor. So that's just something to keep in mind, is you can use different types of lengths, focal lengths for your tubes, and change the magnification you're getting on sensor. Imaging modalities are kind of endless as well. You can do episcopic illumination, so you're sending light in through the microscope objective from a little beam splitter out here. It's using the microscope objective itself as a condenser, hitting the subject, reflecting back, and then going through the beam splitter and then ending back up on the sensor. You can emitted light, which is like a regular microscope where you get optical kind of sections throughout the thing as you rack the focus. You can do polarized light. You can do differential interference contrast. You can do reflected differential interference contrast as well as transmitted. There's a lot to play with when you get to microscopy. Again, numerical aperture is related to the resolution, sharpness, and also when you have higher numerical aperture, remember, very tiny, wide opening, you have a very tiny plane of focus, you have to step in much more tiny increments. There are calculators on here, online for it. The one thing is there is a limit of about 1 as your numerical aperture as the max in air that you can get. You get around that when you're doing oil immersion objectives. You have an oil immersion objective of 1.3, 1.4, much higher resolution. If you're working with air, you can only get a maximum theoretical about numerical aperture of 1. So my highest numerical aperture objective is 0.9 or 0.95. You can also, though, have different immersion media rather than just oil, like a traditional microscope using oil immersion. You can have water immersion objectives too, or glycerin immersion objectives. Really very interesting microscope optics. Here is an unknown fungus on spruce fir pine wood. I have no idea what this is. I imaged it with one of my highest resolution objectives, so it's a pretty crisp photo. But yeah, I just thought it kind of looked cool. I'm not sure if you guys do too, but it's just fascinating to see this tiny little fuzz, you know, like a millimeter of fuzz on wood, and then be like, let's see what that looks like in stacked photo. And I really enjoy this because, again, it's bringing a different view than just traditional microscopy, where you aren't as often using reflected light unless you're doing metallurgical microscopy or something like that.
Data is that photo?
This was about, I think there's about 200 photos and each like 30 megabyte file. So, you know, just like 1 point something gigs, nothing crazy. Yeah, so it'll depend on also the body. So sometimes your body will have a fastest SD card it can take. My newest body, it is able to write pretty fast, but that meant the SD cards are like $180 for a 200 and 56 gigabyte card, right? So the older gen, that was only like, you know, I got a 512 for like $40, right? So you want to match it to the abilities of your camera. You want the fastest one that will work with your camera. But otherwise, you know, a 256 or a 512 will allow you to take 4 or 8,000 photos, which is ridiculous for regular photography. If you're doing stacking, it adds up, right? But like most people don't want to trust 4,000 of their treasured photos on the card before getting it on their computer, right? So yeah, it'll depend in terms of which one you need very on the camera, but I'd say, you know, at least a 128 or 256 for stacking. 128, 256. I also used to shoot tethered, so I wouldn't even transfer it to the card. It would just go straight to my computer. This new one I have to figure out more because I use Linux, and I have to figure out compatibility with Gphoto too. Stropharia rugosa annulata mycelium. Also, resolution depends on numerical aperture or the wavelength of light. Shorter wavelengths of light will allow you to resolve finer details. Working distance, again, different objectives will have a different distance to the subject. It will dictate how much light you're actually able to get in there and bounce off the subject. This was, I thought, going to be a really cool entomopathogenic fungi because I saw some cool yellow fuzz here. But then I let whatever else just keep growing and it rotted and it like got covered in this. But I was actually after whatever this yellow stuff was because under the dissecting microscope, I saw some like weird yellow prongs coming out. But I didn't get to the sample fast enough. It rotted in the tackle box and there's like some cobwebby mold. Please feel free to let me know. Mituatoyo, I think I misspelled that, but have many long working distance objectives, but they can be expensive. You can have some trade-offs. Some microscope optics are pretty cheap. Reading a microscope objective specifications, you'll have a magnification on the side. You'll have a numerical aperture, which is dictates your resolution, dictates your step size. You have infinity symbol, or you'll have 160 millimeter printed on the side, which will say it's a finite objective. You have a -0, you have a // or you have a dash some numbers like 0.17. That is cover slip correction. Cover slip correction is important because if your microscope objective is corrected for a cover slip and you don't use one, you will get spherical aberration. You will get up to a certain point, you'll get spherical aberration or blurry photos once you get about past 0.25 numerical aperture. Once you get to that point, the effect of spherical aberration from a mismatched media in terms of the index of refraction from what it expects in between the optic and the subject will lead to blurry photos. You can also do weird things like glue your cover slip objective to a one that isn't corrected just for air, and you just glue a little cover slip on the front with some black tempera paint. It's been pioneered by, again, photomacrography.net. And now you have an air objective again, because your cover slip is just attached directly to the microscope objective. So there are also designations like internally corrected. You want to make sure that the microscope optic you're getting is not something that it requires the corrections be done in the tube lens, because again, remember those corrections for chromatic aberrations that can come into play. Sometimes a microscope designer will have it so it's all corrected in the eyepieces or the tube lens. And if you use that without those corrective pieces, you're going to get not great images. This is some willow rust, some rust that was on some willow next to my house. Which objectives? Lomo 3.7x is outstanding. Amscope 4x, outstanding, $20. The $60 Lomo outresolves and does better in terms of chromatic aberrations than my $300 lens. Empty tubes. This is a 3D printed tube. I'm happy to print a tube for you if you want to adapt a microscope optic to your camera. This is an empty tube, but I've inserted some flocking material, some low reflection material in here, and that's to impact the amount of stray beams of non-image forming light that would normally bounce up in here and just contribute to haze on the sensor. So you've got to insert some kind of material on the inside of this tube. Otherwise, your images will lose contrast to what they could be. But this was a very simple system I designed in terms of just mounting to an M42 flange. And that means that I have a 3D print, but an actual metal flange for this objective. High numerical aperture at high resolution, but short working distance are harder to work with because they need very tiny steps. And the low means you don't have a lot of space to shine that flash in. As you can see, my rig here typically consists of very maneuverable, and who knows what's showing up on Zoom, but very maneuverable elements for flash because I really need to play with it. And then I get my other one on there and I basically figure out where it needs to be. I insert my diffusion element, which can be just some different diffusion paper. I attach my camera on here and I mount my subject. I have a goniometer, but sometimes I just use this machinist style, depending on the magnification I'm using. I get it framed for the most part, make sure it's there. And then all I do is, instead of manually racking it, but I've been manually racking it recently, is this motor it connects to a microcontroller that is very simple to code up, and it moves every turn 1 millimeter, right? So if I move a quarter of a turn, 0.25 millimeters. Now this motor can move very tiny, precise steps. So it can move in increments of up to, 1/256,000 of one full turn. So that is how I move forward only, 1 micrometer forward. It flashes and then it moves, flashes, moves. And I just go and walk away, because if I'm walking around, actually, I sit down. So if I'm walking in the house, you can see the entire frame just jumble, even if I'm walking at the other side of the house, once you get above like 10x, right? Because you're really, really close to a subject. Field number on an objective is supposed to kind of indicate the useful field of view, but it's not a direct comparison. Can be important. My favorite objective I don't have here, but it was pictured. My favorites is $120 or so used, depending on what kind of bargain you can get. It's a 20x apochromatic Nikon 0.17 corrected, so I put a little cover slip on it, but it resolves very fine details. It's what that like little mushroom or the fungus on the wood was resolved with. That was probably like a $1,500+ microscope objective when it was new, but it's $120 right now, hopefully for a little bit longer. Tube lenses, you can use a telephoto lens. You can also use the DCR 250 or 150, which are some just little close-up adapters. Stacking setups, again, I just showed you right there. What you need is basically something to move forward and back linearly. So I use CNC rails, which can be actually pretty cheap. And I'm hoping to get this published out just so that people can copy it, because this is something that I made in a very specific way that you can just do with hand tools, basically. The commercial setups are like $600 plus sometimes about 400. But the problem is they can be inferior in certain ways. Like mine, I never have resolution problems because I can go as slow as I want. I can fit the microcontroller and the stepper controller and the motor to really do what I want. So this, you could build this like creme de la creme for like $150, and it will outperform the like $1,200 one that like sometimes gets sold. And there are ones that are like $300-400 that you can actually use and just go and not have to buy, build one. And there's ones that are like $600. Again, not building something is great sometimes. So yeah, I've DIY'd several. I even did a little to reduce cost, and I'm hoping that like some people pick up on it and some people want to collaborate, because it's just, again, this is just my limited free time. Sometimes I'll have some time on the weekend or like whenever, just to take like an hour of photography or to do some designs. I did a 3D printed design, so instead of having to source aluminum, you just buy these rails for about $50, and then you 3D print these other parts, and you have the same exact motion system. And then it's about $60 in microcontroller parts, and the code will be online, and there's like multiple people that like have made little things like this. If anyone wants to like do any collaboration, feel free to reach out. If you have any weird old telephoto lenses or any lenses in the focal length of 100 to 200 and you use Sony E especially, I have some curiosities. I want to try some different tube lenses with some of my infinite microscope objectives. But also if you have any just old random lenses in the 100 to 200 millimeter focal length, feel free to reach out, because searching for the best tube lens is kind of another thing you optimize for, because all of your image quality is kind of dictated by how quality the tube lens is and how it cooperates with your microscope optic. Reach out if you want for any of those things, but that is it. I'm happy to answer questions at now and also in the future. I'd love for people to get into any of this, including non-macro. I do non-macro photography for sure, and I take photos of my friends and stuff. It's just something that I'm obsessed with for right now. And sorry for going over. We have some chat, but maybe there's nothing in it. So if there's anything that anyone wants, let me know. Okay, cool. That was just letting me know about the slides. Does anyone have any questions? Are we good? Please go ahead. Yes, and I was trying to look for them right before I came, and I can't find them, and I'm not sure. I'm very disorganized with my photos. I might have deleted them because I was like, I could do better. But yeah, you can take snowflake photos with the 2x macro lens, or I tried with the 10x. Yeah, for sure. I tried with the 10x, and I was getting some pretty cool photos. It's not my like super cool niche, but like I thought they're gorgeous, right? Another thing you can play with is polarized light. So if you add a polarization filter to your flash and then another polarizer in your lens, you can get cross-polarized photography. Cool for transparent subjects.
People are interested to reach out. How do we reach out?
Oh yeah, so let me see. You can do my email, or that is my website, which will eventually be added to, there should be galleries there, but reach out, rsaikali@gmail.com. Yeah, I think that is probably the easiest, rsaikali@gmail.com, or on Facebook, Rami space S. I'm a moderator on the Facebook group, for better or for worse. But hackittogether.com was my website that I was also eventually going to update with galleries and stuff like that, or if you want to buy photos, feel free. But I was going to start to document some of these things so that other people can build them, because there are people, you know, who are super interested in this, like the building aspect, and I like nerding out about that. But feel free to reach out with questions. Again, if all of this was too much technically, that's fine, but I just want to emphasize you can have a lot of fun if you play around. You can find a niche that you're interested in. Just make sure you explore something you're interested in. Don't like think you have to do something because somebody else wants to do it. Cool. Yep. Go ahead.
UV filter and UV lens filters versus light.
What about the UV lens filters?
Versus light versus UV light.
Oh, well, a UV lens filter, I think it would just block out any stray UV. I don't know exactly. I do know that sometimes you'll use like yellow filters and other filters with UV photography to enhance contrast, but I don't know what the exact effect, I guess, of a UV block filter might reduce any UV coming in. But we're doing UV induced fluorescence, so we're imaging not in the UV wavelength, we're just imaging in the visible wavelength from UV that goes out, excites it, and then bounces back a different wavelength of light. So I don't think, unless you're doing like a UV filter isn't important, you might use like a certain color filter to enhance certain colors when doing UV induced fluorescence. I don't think it would be specifically relevant. Now you can do UV photography where you are trying to pass the UV, but that would be like different than the filter. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what if there's anything else that I'm not addressing.
How about infrared?
Yeah, infrared photography is another really cool thing. So you can convert your sensor, like people convert, and they have services. You can send your camera off and get it converted, and it does infrared photography. So
Infrared sport, that's photography in infrared.
I don't know what that would look like. I have done UV before for sure, but I don't know what an infrared converted, because I think, yeah, I don't know what an infrared converted would do with a spore specifically, because I think it's usually like outside scenes and less inside like studio photography or anything like that, of like plant tissue and things like that. So I don't know, IR imaging plant tissue. Maybe it's something to explore. Fungi aren't plants, of course, but you know, IR imaging is a thing in and of itself for sure. For microscope optics for sure as well. Yeah. And again, the cross-polarized light is really cool. Differential interference contrast is really sick. There's a lot you can play with.
Money were no object, we can change your setup.
I think I would just have more cameras. So again, when I said there's no perfect camera, it works really well for this, but I would want like the Canon R7 has very tiny pixels, like 3.3, and it goes up to about 15 frames per second. So it would allow me to get even more resolution out of some of my highest performance objectives, but I wouldn't change it for other things that this is better for, you know. I would probably have one global sensor shutter, you know, camera, which has other trade-offs, but it reads the entire sensor immediately. So you get the ability to use flash while doing electronic shutter. So that's another thing you can do is electronic shutter means that there's no actual physical shutter. It's just, you know, taking a readout of the data. So yeah, I think it would just be that. Plus, you know, for optics, I'm pretty set on like most of my favorite microscope optics. I do want to try water immersion sometimes because I could break the 1.0 numerical aperture limit for air, and I could like dip the fungi in water and image them in water, not have to deal with immersion oil necessarily. A little bit longer working distance for some of the water immersion objectives, and I could get even higher resolution for certain things. Other than that, I spend some money on like little accessories and tidbits, but I'm pretty happy. Maybe a couple of other interesting lenses, but I try not to get too much junk, right? Because like it's easy to collect stuff, and I need to like discipline myself to use it before I can justify like a need for something else. Because I don't know, it's very easy for me, and most people I think to like just get things. Yeah.
You could do anything with the UV lights, like diffusing that.
So that was the So that was the interesting thing that I was thinking about too. I was like, is there like I almost like asked that question online, like, is there a UV diffuser? But I think technically, if as long as there isn't any visible light, it wouldn't matter so much. And these do leak some visible light, right? They have a little bit of a blue hue. I think you don't want the diffusion because the thing is you're inducing the fluorescence, so it is becoming a light source, right? So you can't like diffuse the colors coming back. I think the best you could do is make sure to eliminate as much or deal with higher quality filters to eliminate any of the blue light or the real light from coming out of the UV and just get pure UV out and then just get pure colors back. So yeah, I've thought about that too. And like when I think about it intuitively, I'm like, no, you can't really diffuse it because as soon as you send it through a diffusion element, you're not really doing the same thing because you're turning the specimen into a light source with the UV, right?
Just thinking about my eyeballs, it seems like I'm wondering if you get crazy peaks. Whereas maybe if you diffuse it and did like I don't know, underexposure or something like that.
Right.
They'll almost like
I think,
more places.
yeah, I think instead of diffusion, you'd maybe use like more floody light. So like more sources all around. That would be, I think, because you want it just to be illuminated, but you're right that like you don't want one part of it to be too bright. So I think just more LEDs would be one way to go about that. But yeah, I've been in the same like thought process trying to figure out like how to improve the UV images. And they can be annoying, like because they can just like be too underexposed, too overexposed. But again, I really do want people to play with UV with their camera phones because I think you'd be surprised about the kind of cool stuff that you can see just with your cell phone.
Linux,
Yeah.
like a photo editing, stacking, works on Linux.
Yeah, so it sucks because I have to use Wine, which is not an emulator, but it allows some Windows software to be run. And it's just a tiny bit of a penalty when I'm stacking the raw files rather than JPEG out. So it's a little bit slower. So I've been using my partner's laptop recently because it has Windows on it. But I just begrudgingly use Windows, for like when I need to. So otherwise, all the stacking stuff will work under emulation in Linux. And then there are free tools. Darktable works on Windows or Linux, so that's a free raw developer should you choose to learn about it. And there's tons of videos on how to use it. The only problem is like each of them is like 30 minutes long, and there's like here's part one of my 240 video series on Darktable. So like that's how like deep it goes. Whereas again, Adobe's product is like intuitive, right? It's like less hassle.
They are native for Linux.
For the stacking, no. For Darktable, for raw development, yes. For stacking, you have to use an emulator. So it's not hard. There's a Wine repository, but also it is missing some compatibility. So like some of my graphics card acceleration isn't working, and I would have to dick around with it for quite a bit to try to figure out how to get that working, and it would make the photo stacking stuff faster, right? And I do experience some instability when I'm stacking a lot of photos. Sometimes it'll crash, which is really frustrating if I've retouched some of the photos. So that's why I've been trying to use the Windows stuff. I do wish they were more natively. Zareen does have a build, I think, specifically for Linux, actually. So that might be a little bit more stable for sure, at least. And I do recommend Zareen. Like, they both work really well. Rick has just, spent tons of time increasing like knowledge within the community and without the community. So, the program works excellently well. And some people often prefer Zareen when they're getting the professional level because it has a few other features. It can't directly say one is better than the other, but it does like substack reprocessing, things like that. If you want to do tiny bits and yeah, it can stacking. Just watch some videos. Oh, here's a little tidbit. If you do get a camera, no matter how old your camera is, just go on YouTube and Google, like search how to use this, like settings to use this, because your ability to navigate your phone camera, your digital camera body is going to make it a lot easier, right? Because once you just, can flick around in the menus and know what you're doing, it's less like, oh my God, I'm sweaty and I need to go home and I can't believe I just can't get this dang picture. And YouTube is great for all of this kind of like learning stuff too. So, ask me, go online, photomacrography.net, closeupphotography.com. You'll be able to find a treasure trove of info. It's just how deep you want to dive in. And there's, as deep as you want, or, if you just end up playing around with some UV stuff with your phone, I think that's really encouraging.
Well, mechanical shutter is better than electronic shutter.
Mechanical shutter, it's currently technology limitations dictate that global shutters are hindered right now because of just how we can do them and how we've implemented them. So you have a penalty with the global shutter. So it's better to have a global shutter for very fast moving action. And some of the global shutter only released like a recent one. I think some other ones have. They can do really high FPS sometimes. But mechanical shutter unfortunately has rolling artifacts of a rolling shutter, but currently has a little bit better noise performance rather than trying to read out the entire sensor. Because when you get into it, when you're trying to read out a sensor, it gets really weird, right? Like just the temperature of the sensor will contribute to the noise, right? Just the physical process of reading it will contribute to noise. So when you're trying to get to really high resolution and read out all that data at once, things just get really interesting, like electromechanically. So there are advantages to global shutter for sure. And I wish I had a global shutter camera just for syncing my flash at any speed that I want, and using electronic shutter, because I am worried about, my shutter will eventually die, because I am taking sometimes like 5,000 photos, over the course of 2 hours at home or something, maybe not 2 hours, but like just the stacking. Oh, that didn't work. Let me try it again. Electronic shutter would mean the camera would last forever, right? If I could sync that. So I could use continuous light, which I do sometimes when I'm exploring, but I haven't done as much. Yeah, I'd say that like the interesting through line is like, it depends, right? Or there are trade-offs. That's what I feel like I discover more and more. Yeah. And I don't think there was any Zoom questions. Hopefully, maybe I'm the only one here now. Oh, there's 7 people here. So that's great. Excellent. Well, if anyone else has any other questions, feel free. I'll leave the Zoom on for a second. I'm just gonna pack up for a sec, but otherwise, y'all more than welcome to check out anything or be dismissed. This is like the light I bring when I have been trying to do macro stacking really close up, high speed, because it actually puts out enough light, and I got it used for $70. It does put out enough light that I can handheld stack, which I usually have to do with the flash to freeze the motion. Yeah, we good, or should I end it? Yeah, okay, bye everyone, bye Zoom. Thank you everyone, thanks for staying so long.